It's Bible Club, it's Bible Club, it's Bible Club in our town. There's singing, there's laughing, let's get the word around. We're all excited, and we are all delighted. It's Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club in our town.
All right, so I need some help from the older ones here, okay? And I'm going to explain some things to you older ones, younger ones. You can listen in and find out what the older ones hear. So, today I'm going to tell in the lesson something that our lessons have had me tell you, I think, 3 times already. 3 times. I'm going to tell you about something that happened. 3 times I've already told you. But I was thinking about why are these lessons telling me to tell us this over and over again? And I started looking in the Bible, thinking about it, and actually, the Bible tells us about it over and over again. So, if the Bible tells us about it over and over again, it must be an important thing, right? And, well, we'll get to what that thing is. I think you'll know when we start talking about it. Who is the main man in our stories for the last 2 months or so? I think it would be 2 months or so. You know who he is? David. Did you say Javid?
David.
David. That's right. I thought you said Javid. Okay, well, it was David. She meant David, right? So David is the man in our story, and since we've been talking about him for 2 months, by now he's probably pretty old, right? Do you remember kind of how old he was when we first met David? 15 or 16? Do you remember where David was when we first met him? Where was David when we first... Jackson, do you remember where he was? Where was he? Well, he's in heaven now, yeah, but in our story, where was David when we first met him? Chloe? He was by the sheep. By the sheep. So he was out with the sheep. And what happened in that day when we first met David? When the Bible first tells us about David, what happened? He was out with the sheep, and do you actually know, or are you just thinking of something to say? Yes, you can go with that. Amos? No. He did probably play his harp out with the sheep, and a lion did come along when he was with the sheep. Ian? He was anointed as king of Israel. That's right. He was anointed as king of Israel, but he didn't become king right away, did he? It was a long time. Cody remembers how long it was. How long was it between when he was anointed king and when he was just king of Judah? Do you remember that? Like from 17 to 30. So about 13 years, and then 7 more years in Hebron, or Hebron, however they say it these days. So 20 years before he was king over all of Israel. But David was king for, and I don't think I told you this, he was king for 40 years. Counting the 7 in Hebron, and then 33 over all of Israel. So he was king for a long time. Do you know how long our presidents are president of the United States? If they only serve 1 term? How long? 4 years. And then they can be reelected, right? For 4 more years. But then they're done, right? David, if he was the president, it would be like he was elected 10 times to be king. 40 years he was king over Israel. That's a long time. God blessed him. What did God say about David? When he was a young man, he said, David is a man...
After his own heart.
Yes, after his own heart. Did that mean that David never sinned? No. We know David sinned, don't we? How do we know that David sinned? How do we know that David sinned? Who told us about David's sins? Thomas?
God.
God did. In the Bible, right? So So God knew he was a sinner, but God still said he was a man after his own heart. So what do we, if David was a sinner and he was a man after God's own heart, how can that be true? What did David think about his sin once the preacher came and said, you were the one? Ian?
He asked God to forgive him.
He asked God to forgive him. He admitted. He confessed his sins, and he asked God for forgiveness. He was soft. Everyone sins. But once we've sinned, once we realize we've sinned, we can't keep sinning. If we keep sinning, if we're like, I don't care, I'm going to sin anyway, that's not being somebody that God would say is a person after his heart, is it? So David was king for 40 years, and he got to be pretty old. Now there's two things I just want to tell you about today. One is this thing that we've heard about a lot. And when David was king, he was very old. He's thinking about who is going to be the king after me. He remembered a very important time. Remember David, he had conquered all of his enemies. He had taken over the city of Jerusalem, and he built up Jerusalem to be his capital city. Do you remember at one time, he brought the Ark of the Covenant to the capital city. And he built his own palace and all his government buildings there in Jerusalem. And he was sitting there in his house, and he was looking at the beautiful house that he had, that God had let him build, and he had an idea. Do you remember what that idea was? What was his idea back then? He was sitting there, I had this beautiful house that I'm living in, and he had a great idea. Ian's saying he knows. He's going to let someone else try to answer. Amos?
He wanted to build a temple.
Do you remember that? He wanted to build a temple. He said, the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent, and I live in a house. I'd like to build a temple. And so he told the prophet, I want to build a temple for the Lord. I want to build a house for the Lord. It'll be glorious and majestic, because God gets all the honor, and God should be exalted above all. I'm in a house, and the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent. I want to build a temple for God. And what did the man of God say? He said, first, I'm sorry, you're right, but first he said, good idea. And then that night, God said to him, go back and tell David what?
No, his son's gonna make it.
Right. No, your son is going to do it. Now at that time, David didn't know which son. And God told David one other thing, very, very important thing. Before he said, your son will build the temple, he said, God said, I am going to build you a house to David. Now, David already lived in a house, didn't he? So what did God mean when he said to David, I'm going to build you a house? Some of you older ones know. You know what he meant? You remember? Cody? In heaven? Okay. That's not right. That's not what he meant, but it's a good answer. What he meant was he was going to establish David's house as king over Israel forever. So what he meant was, since David was a man after his own heart, he was going to bless David by making sure that there would always be one of David's sons, or, of course, grandsons or great, all the way down the line. Always there would be somebody from David who would be king over Israel. That was a tremendous honor. The king before David, were any of his sons on the throne? Was David the son of the king before? He wasn't. He wasn't. So God said, I'm going to make it so one of your sons will always be on the throne. And I'm going to teach your son. And then and this time, David is thinking back about this, and God let David know which son would be the king. He said, I want your son Solomon. Now there's a play on words there. he said, David, you can't build my temple because you have been a man of war. And he was. He fought lots of battles. He killed Goliath. He fought all the enemies of Israel. He said, your son will be a man of peace. And his son, he had a son whose name was Solomon, which means peace in it, actually. So, Solomon was going to be his son. And so David said, okay, that's fine. That's great. In fact, I don't deserve that at all, God, that you would make it so that my sons will be king forever. And before we leave this idea, some people might be thinking, but there's no son of David that's king over Israel right now. But there is. Because when Jesus was born, he was born in the family of David. And people called him the Son of David. And Jesus is king today. He doesn't sit on a throne in Jerusalem, but the Bible says someday he will sit on the throne in Jerusalem. Because Jesus is alive, right? He died. He went down into the grave. He was raised again from the dead. But did he die after that? No. He went up into heaven. He alive. He went up into heaven in the clouds, and he's up in heaven right now. And someday he's going to come back in the clouds just like what he went. And he's going to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. So God is still keeping his promise to David, but he didn't let David build the temple. So did David get all upset about that? No. He collected all the materials that they would need to build this wonderful tabernacle. He had stacks and stacks of gold and silver and bronze and iron. So much iron that you could not even weigh it. He had just rows and rows of huge boards of timber and the wood that you would need to put into the temple. And he showed it to Solomon and said, look, I have prepared all of this, and we're going to ask all the people who love the Lord to give to this. And the people brought even more to it, and they crowned Solomon king. And so now David was almost dead, but since he was very, very old, and he couldn't be the king anymore, they crowned Solomon king, and Solomon became king. And when Solomon became king, he was fairly young. He was not 40 years old or 30 years old even. He was probably more like 20 years old. And to you guys, that's kind of old, but that's not that old. Compared, like me, I look back at 20. I wouldn't want to be the king of a whole country when I was 20. It would be nice to be king of the whole country, but I think I would make lots and lots of mistakes if I was the king. But God had said Solomon will be the king. So the people, they crowned Solomon king, and he became king. And Solomon loved God at this time. He loved God and wanted to worship God and thank God for allowing him to be the king. And so he took lots of the rulers and the leaders of the people, and they went to the tabernacle where everybody would worship God. Now, the tabernacle was not in Jerusalem because the temple had not been built yet. So they went to the tabernacle, and they brought over 1,000. Now that's a lot. Over 1,000 sacrifices, and they sacrificed all the animals, and they celebrated, and they worshiped God and thanked God for allowing them to have a new king. Now, soon after that, Solomon was asleep one night. And this, I want you to think about this. Solomon was sleeping, and he had a dream, and in his dream, God spoke to him. But it was in those days, God did speak in dreams. Now, God doesn't need to speak in dreams. How does God speak to us today? Thomas?
In the Bible.
In the Bible. If we want to know what God said, we can read it. It's right there. Right? But back then, there was some of the Bible, but not everything. And so God spoke to Solomon in a dream, and he said to Solomon, now think of this question. Think about who asked it, and think about if you were asked this question. He said to Solomon, ask for whatever you want from me. that. No, it wasn't the President of the United States saying, ask me for whatever you want. It wasn't the Queen of England saying, ask me for whatever you want. It wasn't, whatever, the rich Arabian Sultan, the oil mogul saying, ask for whatever you want. It wasn't anybody like that. God said to Solomon, ask me for whatever you want. Now think of what you could ask for from God. What could you ask God for? What could you ask God for? If God said to you, which if you tell me that God in a dream told you this, I'm going to say, what did you have for dinner? But imagine, use our imagination, and we have imaginations, don't we? If God came to you and said, ask me for whatever you want, what could you ask God for? What do you think Solomon could have asked God for? What are some things that we could ask God for? If you know the story, don't tell us what Solomon asked for first. If you don't know the story, just say whatever it is that comes to your mind. What do you think you could ask God for? Moses, what could you ask God for? I thought you had something in your mind by the way you looked. Jackson, you could ask him for a Bible. Raylan?
Chicken nuggets.
Chicken nuggets?
Yeah.
But he could get you chicken nuggets, but he could get a lot more than chicken nuggets. Somebody here said something a little bit bigger than that. Was that you, Maddie?
A healthy life.
A healthy life. You could say, God, let me live for a long time. And let me live healthy for a long time. Right? Could God do that? Oh, he can do anything, can't he? What would be something else kind of like that you could ask God for? That Solomon could have asked God for? Can anybody think of something? Peyton? Okay, so he is the king already. But so that he's already the king. Ian? Gold and riches. Yeah. He could say, could I just have even more gold and riches? Could God give him gold and riches? Yeah, God could give him gold and riches. He could have said, can you make it so that everybody likes me and honors me and obeys me? Could God do that? Could God work in the kingdom and make everyone think of Solomon and respect him and do everything that he wanted? Yes, he could have done that. But let me tell you what Solomon asked for. God said, ask me for whatever you want. And Solomon, Chloe, Solomon said, God, I'm young. And you have made me king, and I have to make rules and laws, and I have to judge between my citizens who's right and who's wrong. I don't know that I know exactly how to do that. Please give me wisdom. Please help me to know what is right and what is wrong. Do you think God liked that answer? Do you think God liked that request? He sure did. God said to Solomon, because you have asked of wisdom for me, because you've asked for wisdom to be able to judge your people rightly and make just laws for them, I'm going to give you what you didn't ask for. Solomon, because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you riches. I'm going to make you the richest king of Israel that there has ever been. I'm going to give you honor. I'm going to make it so other kings will come and other queens will come and honor you because you're the king. I'm going to do that. And if you obey me and worship me for the rest of your life, I will give you a long life. And if you worship me and obey me, I will make it so one of your sons is king forever. Now, it wasn't automatic that one of his sons would be king forever. God had already promised that to David, but David had more than one son, didn't he? Okay. So, Solomon then got almost the same promise that David did. And God did bless Solomon. And Solomon, for a long time, obeyed God. And we'll have to see next week how God blessed him with all those riches and wisdom, and if Solomon obeyed God for the rest of his life. So, what can we remember? Two things. Remember David? David reminded us again about how he wanted to do something for God, but God said no. Right? And sometimes we want to do something with our life. We think this is a good idea, but we find out from reading the Bible or listening to the teaching or listening to the preaching that we shouldn't do that. In the end, what's better? To do what we think is right or what God tells us is right? What God tells us is right? And then, so that's the one thing we remember about David reminding us about how God didn't let him do everything that he wanted to do. And then we should remember what is the right things to ask God for. Should we always be asking God, God, can I have a lot of money so I can have nice clothes or a fancy car or something like that? No. God, can you make it so everybody likes me? Not necessarily. No. But we should pray that God will give us wisdom. And you should know that God has given us wisdom. It's in the Bible. But we don't always understand what the Bible says. So we should pray to God that he would show us what to read in the Bible, where to find the answers to the questions that we're looking for. We have questions, but it's a big book, isn't it? Where can we find the answers? God can help us find the answers. And then how to understand what the Bible says. And then, like we learned in our verse before, God says to do it. And then he says what? Trust me. Just do it. So, and that's something that Solomon is going to learn, isn't he? He's the one actually that wrote Proverbs 3:5. So, let's try to remember these things. And we'll see next week what Solomon did during his 40 years of being king.